The host of Horrors beta was announced and released recently, and holy does it have a lot to be excited for. Let's call it the least relevant structures out of the way, starting off with the Sawhorse. This structure has one primary focus, and that is to make decorations. The decorations themselves are just that, they're decorations. They have no real purpose outside of just looking good and having some funny little quotes attached to them, but that's really about it. With that little bit out of the way, let's get into the new event that's been added, which is the Lunar Shard Rain. This is a new event that causes the overworld to drop moonglass shards from the sky, similarly to how cave-ins work in the caves. You can use a couple things to protect yourself from this, with the biggest ones being the umbrella and the above average trees. Next up, there's a new Wagstaff interaction that vaguely falls under the category of an event. This interaction happens after a rift is open for a couple days, and it's just Wagstaff running across your screen. If you follow him around for a bit, he'll lead you to new structures that drop scrap, which is used to make a couple of new items. The W.A.R.B.I.S headgear and armor go hand in hand with one another. Aside from both functioning as 85% damage reduction armor with 5 planar defense, engaging in combat while you have them equipped will activate the headgear and the body armor, allowing you to scan an enemy for more information on it. And while that enemy is in the process of getting scanned, you'll gain a speed and damage boost from each piece of armor respectively, with the body armor granting up to a 30% speed boost while fighting, and the headgear giving up to a 20% damage increase when it scans. This armor is pretty interesting, but its crafting recipe is pretty expensive, requiring a lot of scrap and an enlightened shard per each one. This means that if you want to get the 2 armor pieces, you'd need to kill Celestial Champion a minimum of twice for these armor pieces. Or you could just deconstruct the Enlightened Crown, but who wants to do that? This is far from what all there is in this update, however, with potentially the biggest part of this update being the brand new bosses. 3 bosses have become corrupted by lunar energies, turning them into lunar counterparts of themselves. Bearger, Deerclops, and the Varg have all gotten new fights and mechanics, and in order to start the fight, you need to have rifts enabled and need to find and kill the bosses normally. This will leave the boss's corpse on the floor for a while after death, and while you have rifts open, a bright shade gestalt will spawn and float towards the corpse. This is the point where you could light the boss on fire if you want to avoid what is to come, but assuming you don't, the gestalt will possess the boss corpse and initiate the new fight. These fights are incredibly involved, and I'd highly recommend trying and learning the fights yourself. So if you want to do that, skip ahead in the video because I'm about to spoil the fights themselves. Starting off with Deerclops. This boss visually is absolutely brutal. The fight itself is pretty interesting as the boss will radiate a freezing aura, similar to what Klaus's deer does with its attack, just around the boss, although this won't freeze you directly, so. Deerclops will slam the ice crystals on its back at the player as an AoE attack twice, before regenerating them. While it's regenerating, it's your opportunity to exploit one of the new fight mechanics that is shared between each boss, which is just stunning them. Stunning each boss is different between the 3, but for Deerclops, all you have to do is light the boss on fire when it starts regenerating the crystals on its back. This will stun Deerclops, letting you get more damage in for what is essentially just free. And that's about it for the Deerclops fight. Just be careful not to stay near it without a way to heat yourself up, since your biggest threat in this fight is honestly just freezing to death. Next up is Bearger. Bearger gains what is effectively an exoskeleton and does not let up when he's fighting. This boss does have a conal shape to its attacks, and it's not purely an area around itself like other enemies where it doesn't really matter what direction the enemy is facing. This is a very important mechanic in the fight, since the best way to stun this boss is to run behind it and bait out its butt slam. The ground pound attack comes out pretty quickly, and does just attack everything around it in an AoE. If you manage to bait out the butt slam and dodge it, then you need to hit Bearger as he's getting back up in order to stun him. This lets you get free hits in, but if you don't want to take any damage during the fight at all, you can still do it without needing to stun him. Bearger follows roughly a 3-hit and dodge pattern, but be aware that if you don't want to stun him, then the timing is very strict for the most part, and getting hit by one swing all but guarantees that you'll get hit by his follow-ups, hitting you for big damage if not outright just killing you. This boss is a menace when it comes to fighting, so be sure to have plenty of healing and try your best to stun him when and where you can. Lastly is the possessed Varg. This boss is pretty unique in that it's the only one that gets a variant that isn't a giant. The boss fight consists of normal Varg behavior, of spawning hounds to harass you during the fight, with these turning into horror hounds when they die regardless of the stage of the moon, and regardless of whether or not you have moonstorms enabled. Other than that, you could follow most normal Varg kiting patterns, with the exception being his fire breath. This will get the Varg to spit out an AoE fire effect in front of him, hitting you with an endothermic fire, which means you'll be freezing and won't really need to worry about the boss catching things on fire around it, but it's still being a pretty big threat. This boss fight is pretty difficult since your window to stun the boss is while it's winding up to spit fire at you, and if you don't have a way to deal with the hounds consistently, whether that be through a bait pen, bright shade staff, or bright shade bombs, then you're not even going to be able to capitalize on stunning it because you'll be too busy swatting away all of the hounds that it spawns. Killing each of these bosses will result in Wagstaff quote-unquote thanking you for doing so, and he'll give you the Spark Arc. The Spark Arc is used to make the 3 new boss items, and it must be charged by going into the archives and dropping it to gain the charge of one of the sentry. Going through the new items, Crystal Deerclops' item is the Ice Crystaleyezer, with an I, which does a couple of really useful and helpful things. Starting off, it'll act as an Ocuvigil, revealing portions of the map while it's got the Deerclops eyeball slotted in it. Next, it'll decrease the world temperature within an area around it, about the size of a lightning rod. This is really nice, not only as a way to prevent yourself from overheating, but also because it lowers the world temperature. It'll prevent things in its radius from smoldering, effectively working as a better fling-o-matic. Bearger's item is the Polar Bearger Bin, which is basically just a lunchbox. You put crockpot foods in it, and it'll drastically decrease the rate at which they spoil by a grand total of 90%. And it can hold quite a bit of things, so it's a pretty good option since, as opposed to the bundling wrap, it doesn't take 3 grass every single time you want to get things in and out of it. It also doesn't take up any equip slots, effectively just being an inventory within your inventory. The Varg's item is my personal favorite. The Howlitzer is a ranged weapon that shoots hound teeth, dealing 34 planar and 34 normal damage, leading to a total of 68 points of damage to most enemies. This is the equivalent of a dark sword, but is a bit more expensive as time goes on, and this isn't necessarily a primary weapon to use for everything, since the amount of hound teeth it uses up if you want to kill bosses becomes incredibly high, with Klaus needing about 5 stacks to kill him with only the Howlitzer, just as a point of reference. That puts it in a weird position where it's a fine option in the shortened day-to-day, but a much more expensive option when used solely in fighting bosses. The best time you can use it against bosses, in my experience and in my opinion, is when you're waiting out certain phases. Think Celestial Champion when he just drops a bunch of AoE rocks on you. Either way, this item is really good, if only to get rid of tons of hound teeth that the players accumulate over the course of the game. It also being one of the very few ranged weapons that has a solid amount of ammo and a solid amount of damage, gives it a pretty good use overall. Ultimately though, I think this update is pretty great. I think it's got a lot of interesting features and mechanics, but it does have a couple big problems, with the biggest one being the time gate. In order to get these new 3 items, you'll need to fight all 3 bosses a total of 3 times per item, which would be fine as a bit of a challenge to the player if you want these items, which are really good. But there is one big obstacle in the way, and that's Bearger. Because you have to kill all 3 to get the new Spark Arc, only killing 2 will mean that you'll have to wait a whole year before you can kill the 3rd, since Bearger has no way to be spawned in other than just naturally through normal world events. Varg, of course, can be forced in through hunts, and Deerclops can be spawned with the hostile flare, but Bearger is the only boss that you'll have to wait a full in-game year to kill because he only spawns in autumn. This needs to change in my opinion, since locking items behind just waiting is incredibly annoying. I think that's one of the primary reasons they changed Pearl from requiring cactus flowers to requiring whatever it is that she requires now. Hopefully Clay either changes the hostile flare to make it spawn Bearger, or it, changes like some mechanic in how Bearger spawns. I don't know, something just needs to change about it. Other than that one thing though, I really do like the new updates. I think that most of the mechanics are pretty engaging, with my only complaint being the aforementioned time-gated boss and the Moonshard Rain. Personally, I'm not a fan of the Moonshard Rain for the same reason I'm not a fan of cave-ins, and that is that it's just kind of annoying to deal with. When it happens, there's no real way to avoid it, except now there's a consistent way to deal with it in the caves in the form of pillars. Whereas the surface Moonshard Rain forces you to drop an umbrella wherever you might be, or force you to stick around the edges of the map where you have above average trees planted. It just feels kind of annoying to me, but it's not even that big of a deal, all things considered. If anything, I'm just nitpicking about that point, but that's all I really have to say about this update for now. Clay's still tweaking things here and there, so if you have anything you'd want to recommend to them, be sure to do it in the forums where they can easily see and take in each recommendation as they see fit. And feel free to let me know what you guys think about this update, because it's definitely one of the more interesting ones in recent memory. But that's really all I wanted to talk about, so until next time, bye-bye.